Hello and welcome to Beneath the Surface. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Paul Morano, and my guest today going beneath the surface with me is Mr. Bob LeBlanc. And Beneath the Surface is a show that delves, obviously, beneath the surface, as its name says, on matters important to you, where faith and reason meets and where truth, life, and love are one. Tonight, our show is all about the 50th anniversary of Roe versus Wade. We are recording this show on January 22nd, 2023, which means it is literally the 50th anniversary of Roe versus Wade. Now, as you know, Roe versus Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court in July on the feast day of the Sacred Heart, incidentally. But so much damage has taken place since that Supreme Court decision. And we're going to talk about this with my guest, Bob. And basically, I want to talk about and zero in on how we got here and what the cure is. And I don't think we're going to understand the cure unless we really understand how we got here. So those two things are intimately related. And I am going to make the case, and I think Bob agrees with me, that virtually all pro-life organizations today don't get it. They don't understand what the cure is to our culture of death, which, by the way, since Roe versus Wade, has taken approximately 70 million human beings from us that should be under 50 years old today, but they're missing because they've been aborted before birth. And those are only the surgical abortions. If you were to add all of the chemical abortions and the IUDs involved in abortions since 1973, multiply that 70 million by around 12 to 15. And that's what you get for the amount of prenatal homicides that have occurred since Roe versus Wade of 1973. We're talking at least 1 out of 2 people that should be here under 50 years old are missing because they've been murdered before birth. What can you say about that? It's just, we could do a whole show on that, but fortunately we can't. Mr. Bob LeBlanc. Bob, how are you?
I'm doing well, Paul. Thank you for having me here.
Good, good. What are your thoughts on this? Let's first, let me ask you this. What is the cure to where we are today? And I ask this in this context, that um, a lot of people, I think, might have thought once you overturn Roe versus Wade, everything will go back to normal and we won't be killing preborn people anymore. Obviously, that's not going to happen. The country has been so used to, so habitually dependent on murdering children for 50 years doing it. That's been our habit for 50 years. Of course, if Roe never took place, then it would have been a much more um, slow, deliberate process, and who knows where we would be today. But because of Roe, it got everybody who doesn't have a deep spiritual foundation, got everybody used to the fact that this is just a way of life, that if you fornicate, you get yourself pregnant. You don't want to be pregnant, you murder your child. Of course, we pretend it's not a child because it's preborn, and it snowballs from there. What do you think, Mr. Bob, is the cure to this mess?
Well, I think it's a change of heart. I think that's really the what needs to be done. I'm not sure if arguments really work all that well. I mean, we
Why?
are a
Why do you
rational,
think? Why do you think
you know,
that is?
we are a rational species.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that. But we're also a fallen rational species, and I've argued for pro-life almost I remember arguing in the 1980s, so that's how long I've been arguing for life.
Yeah.
And and I don't know,
Have you changed anybody's mind?
I don't think I've changed anybody's mind. uh, uh,
Okay.
maybe there's some unheard of person.
Yeah.
Nobody has ever walked up to me and said, Bob, you've convinced me. Most of the time, in my talks, people who agree with me were people who agreed with me before I
Right.
even started
Right.
talking with them. Uh,
Okay. Those who don't agree with you and who won't be convinced by arguments, why? What
I think
happens?
I think it's a problem of the heart. Uh, And in fact, you had actually a pretty good Facebook post recently that dealt with the fact that people who are immersed in sin find it very difficult to mature. And I think that's exactly what's happening. There's a hardening of hearts that occurs, and so the I think the problem is that we've been aiming at the intellect for this. We think that the argument will solve this, but what actually
Right.
needs to happen is actually a conversion of heart, a softening of heart, so that their minds would be open to listen to the arguments that we're making.
And
Um,
how does one soften hearts?
if it were that easy, I would be doing that right now.
Yeah.
I think well, I think we have the gospel message of Christ. It's a message of love, and it's I don't think it's something that is argued, but rather something that is demonstrated. And
Well, let me back up a little bit, and we'll get to that a little more. We'll flesh that
okay,
out. But how did we get to all of these hardened hearts that think nothing about our abortion age, that so many preborn human beings are being brutally killed? Um, how did that happen since abortion was virtually unheard of before the 1970s? And all of a sudden, you have at least 50%, according to the polls, it's a lot more now than 50%, that have these hardened hearts that you're talking about. So how did it all, in a sense, relatively speaking, all of a sudden happen from the 1960s to from till today? How did all these hardened hearts get hardened?
well, I think there are multiple reasons.
Okay.
Some of them deal with the fact that we're fallen humanity, and some of them actually deal with technology. We need to recognize that technology has actually changed the terrain that we live in the world. Um, so most of the time, I focus in on our changing idea of human sexuality, and usually I point toward contraception as the point that we should actually kind of focus in on, because it actually deals with the procreative act, and what we've done with contraception is separate the procreative act from procreation.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and
what does
and
that do?
well, we have people who are, in a certain sense, I won't say this is in a literal sense, but in a certain sense, they engage in the procreative act and they're surprised that a baby has resulted from this act.
Yeah.
That
It was a
how could this
mistake.
happen?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Um, and so and this happened over a large period of time. We saw it in America through Margaret Sanger. She was promoting birth control. She was a Catholic as well. She was raised Catholic.
Or he's Catholic. Yeah.
Um, but we also saw a major event within the Christianity, the Lambeth Conference in
Yeah.
1930,
Right.
the first real major break in the teachings of traditional Christianity, first
Yeah.
break on the teaching on contraception, when they said it would be permissible in certain circumstances, which that fell apart almost immediately.
Right. 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 Once you open the door a little bit, it flies open. But abortion was seen before the 1970s as absolutely, with most people, absolutely unthinkable. And still, in third world countries around the world, people think you're joking when you say that people are killing their children before birth. It's absolutely unthinkable that such a thing would be occurring in society, particularly as much as it is. So I guess I guess what we're saying here is, and I want to zero in on this because I think it's extremely important. You're saying that the popularization of using contraception, artificial birth control, which, by the way, was legalized in the United States in 1965. If you're not aware of that, Let that sink in. Contraception was illegal before 1965. All right, so it became legal, then the pill was invented, and that became popularized right around that time. So society's getting used to taking this contraceptive pill, which separates sex from procreation. And of course, that eventually well, pretty immediately separates sex from marriage because procreation is no longer seen as a fruit of sex. Everything is just completely disintegrated. And so you have, and now beginning in the late 60s, early 70s, you got a fornication culture that has been formed by the popularization of contraception vis-a-vis the pill. What do you do with the fornication culture? We haven't had one in the last 2,000 years. What do you do with the fornication? Well, what you have to do is you have to figure out a way to stop those babies from being born. And if artificial birth control doesn't do the trick, which it usually doesn't, then you need a backup plan. So the contraception created a fornication culture, which created an abortion culture. And since then, it's been snowballing. And now people are being born into this world. People, I guess the Generation Zers, and even the millennials have most of them have lived in a world where there has been nothing but legal abortion. So
Could I interject something here,
yeah,
Paul?
this is what I want you to do. Yes.
So the comment that you made about contraception, the reason why the pill was so great is because it was so effective in preventing conception. Now the problem is that the way the human mind works, they think that this is supposed to prevent it 100% of the time, when it actually doesn't. There's always uh, what they call best use failures, meaning
Mm,
that even if you use the product exactly the way the designers intended, it
right.
still fails. And that's somewhere around, 98%. But the fact that people start fornicating with the expectation that you're not going to have a baby as a result of this fornication,
Right.
um, um, then
It's
all of a
it's the contraceptive mentality that
yes.
even if you're not using contraception, now you have abortion to fix the problem and murder your
Yes,
child, but you
it's
have to
this.
pretend it's not a child.
What happens is I think we could bring in virtue ethics into this
Yeah.
description. So what happens when a couple is fornicating? They're using contraceptions. They're not developing
Sometimes.
a virtue of self
Right.
control to
Yeah.
prevent themselves, and all of a sudden they become in the passion of the moment, and they've got to say, wait a second, for whatever reason, we don't have the contraceptive device or pill or whatever that we needed to protect ourselves from this.
Yeah.
They can't say no in that particular moment. So they go ahead and do it. So you have the imperfect use that happens as well.
Yeah. No question. And so it seems what we, you know, it's a shame that we don't have all day to talk about this, but the popularization of contraception opened up a premarital sex culture which demanded abortion. That's exactly what happened. Griswold versus Connecticut led a few years later to Roe versus Wade. And then, of course, no fault divorce came in the midst of that. And so everything is disintegrating, beginning with the disintegration of the sex act itself.
In Planned Parenthood versus Casey, you had the Supreme Court acknowledging what you just said. Because of the expectation of people using um, abortion as contraceptive of last resort, we need
Yeah.
to keep Roe intact.
Yeah. And of course, what happens is that the contraceptive mentality continues itself to snowball. If you separate the meaning of sex from procreation, then they become totally different things. And what does that mean? Well, sex can be used any way you want it, in any perverted way you want it, and it rationalizes homosexuality as well as other things that are non-procreative by their very nature. And then over here, you've got procreation without sex. And so this rationalizes all this new procreative technology that we have that completely um, that replaces the marital act and try attempts to create human life in a petri dish. The whole life, the human life process becomes mechanicalized or mechanized, if you will.
Maybe
Um,
maybe what you just said might bring in a solution. And I've always thought this. Um, what has happened with abortion is that we've devalued the human person or the human being
yeah, oh, big
uh,
time.
big time. And indeed, in vitro, we're doing that. We're making the child, instead of a product of love, a
Right.
commodity. And so I think one of the answers is to actually restore this high vision of humanity, of the human person, to restore that to
I mean, most people that have continued to have that vision of humanity recoil in such a very deep way at the idea of killing a preborn child, no matter how mature that child is, whether it be 2 days after conception or 9 months after conception. It doesn't matter. That just internal intuitive recoil of oh, how could you possibly think of doing that? How how do you, I guess, give that to other people who have lost that? Because at least 50% of our country has lost that.
I think actually we probably need to go to the cross,
Yeah.
to see that within, uh, you know, to translate that into the value of a human being. Of course, we as both Christians recognize the importance of the crucifixion in our salvation history. Though this is God raising up human beings actually to a level never before seen. Uh,
Mhm. So
uh,
you don't think that a person can value human life like we just were talking about without a religious dimension?
no, I'm not saying that. I'm
Okay.
saying that within our fallen culture, the way it is,
Yeah.
this seems to be the only path
Out.
to out. I certainly would recognize there have been pagans who do have a high vision of the human being, but I don't
Okay.
think that's the ordinary thing, though.
Okay. So basically in the mud pond that we live in our culture, um, in order to be in order to see clearly, you need to be rescued out of that in order to see clearly and have that internal intuitive understanding of the value of life.
Yes, I really agree, and I think it's not merely throwing Christianity at people. I think that's probably part of the problem is
Okay.
to use Christianity as a club rather than something that is salvific.
Yeah.
Um, uh,
Well, right now, practically speaking, I see personally that contraception created the contraception culture and mentality created the fornication culture, which we have since the late 60s, which created the abortion culture. That's what my understanding of the one, two, three that happened. And then of course that continued. It's snowball with divorce and homosexuality and even transgenderism that we have now. Another show for that. But it seems to me, if I were to just use simple logic, that in order to um, end abortion, which is resting on the fornication culture, we need to end fornication and have
yes.
premarital sex be thought of as unthinkable, like it was with most people when the culture was more Christian. But then, in order to end our premarital sex culture, you have to end what's holding that up and what really began that, as we talked about, and that is the contraceptive mentality. In other words, I don't think this is my thesis. I don't think you can end abortion like so many pro-life organizations are saying without first ending fornication, and that takes ending contraception. You have to aim at contraception, and then the whole house of cards will fall. If you aim at abortion, you won't get it. Your thoughts?
No, I agree with that. But I also think that this is also necessitates a change in behavior of even Christians.
No question.
Um, uh, um, the interesting thing in the early time
Hello? Are you there?
had a kind of fornication culture, uh, and Christians startled uh, uh, these pagans by the fact that they just refused
Hmm.
to engage in what the other culture is. And I think Christians need to be that example again
Yes.
of that
Yes.
example of purity that doesn't
Yeah.
exist right now.
According to my recording for this show, we have only 5 minutes left, and then it just cuts us off. So let's get to this. How does this society of ours in 2023 become a society that recoils at the fact of premarital sex, and that people aren't saving themselves for each other for marriage? How do we get people to that point again?
I wonder, there was a time frame when John Paul II's theology of the body was the rage within
Yeah.
Catholicism. And maybe that's not the exact magic bullet, but I think it's pretty close to that magic bullet because, and even through my own personal experience, as a lapsed Catholic becoming Catholic, um,
Mm.
there was joy in my life just to be able to interact with a female human being and not have to worry about what's going to happen in that date or that courting or
Right.
whatever. It just you just clear your mind and interact with the human being in front of you.
But do you
That
think I'm sorry because we only have a couple few minutes left. But do you think theology of the body is more cerebral? Is it's going to change hearts?
um I think it can change hearts, but I don't think it's going to change hearts by saying, you need to read his book.
Yeah.
I think what you really need to do is people actually living out the theology of the body and understanding the meaning of what John Paul was trying to transmit through the theology of the body in a more deeper way than rather a cerebral way, but actually a living out way.
What about, and this is just a totally different direction. What about hatred of sin and fear of hell? Do you think that needs to come back more for this to
Um,
happen?
Yeah, one of the complaints about the aftermath of Vatican II is that this
Yeah.
kind of universalism that permeates
Yeah.
throughout Christianity, and I think that has some sort of merit that has merit to it.
Yeah. It seems like we need a positive approach and a negative, which is positive in value, but a negative approach to it. And that is the high theology of the body and the constant traditional understanding of sin and hell, and have a horror for this and a joy and hope for this. Yes?
I no, I do agree. I've never really bought this universalism thing,
Right.
though I
Well,
do understand, kind of variations like we can dare hope that all people are saved, that sort of thing.
but I wrote an article about this recently. It seems to me like if you don't start with fear of hell and a healthy fear of God, I don't think that you mature into a proper love of God.
I think you're correct. I never really had this dread fear of God, but I've
Hmm.
always had, even now, I still have a healthy respect for the idea that I could lapse in faith again.
Yeah.
There's this real awareness of my own fallen humanity that may just decide to reject God and therefore
Mm.
place myself in hell. It's
Yeah.
not a rejection of the power of God, but rather the rejection
Yeah.
of the idea that I'm guaranteed somehow heaven.
Yeah. My own sin and weakness that goes with
Yeah.
that. We got a minute left. So really quickly, today is the 50th anniversary of Roe versus Wade, where we have been basically practicing a genocide for the past 50 years. We are missing probably around 50% of all of our friends and neighbors that should be near us, living with us, but are gone because they've been killed before birth. Your last thoughts, your final thoughts on where we are and what to do.
Well, I think there needs to be a true conversion that happens in people's hearts, intellectual, spiritual, and the way we live our lives.
And
I am
that
the way,
will,
the truth, and the life, as
and
Jesus says.
but for those who don't have the faith, you will, or we should all do what? Live our lives as examples? Is that what you're saying? And that'll
Live our
spread?
lives as examples, but it also means that we also preach as well. I mean, it's not purely I'm just going to my life is going to be the gospel, but rather we do actually need to be positive and invite
Yeah.
people into the church.
So preach with our lives, preach with our words, and pray to God for a new evangelization, a new springtime, I guess, a new springtime in the church and in the world.
Yeah, we definitely need grace.
Without that, our culture of death will kill us all. Thank you, Mr. Bob. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the show. It's a sad show, but it had to be done. May the next 50 years be 50 years of celebrating life.
Indeed.
Okay, thank you all for listening. My name is Paul Morano, and that is another edition of Beneath the Surface. We will see you next time. God bless. And